So the Gallup did a study of workers, and this I'll start to talk about staff a little bit, but also players. And they basically, they've basically had engaged, kind of not engaged, and actively disengaged. And engaged employees were the ones who were the most enthusiastic. The ones who were not engaged, they might be satisfied, but they're not connected, right? They don't put in the extra effort, but they do what they're supposed to do. And then you had the actively disengaged, man. They're emotionally disconnected from the work and their job, and they can jeopardize their team's performance. So 3 groups: engaged, not engaged, and actively disengaged. And what they found was, when they looked at most companies, man, like just between 10 and 20%, like 18% of guys were actively disengaged. And about, 15% of guys were engaged, but it was that other 68% of these workers that were not engaged. And this is one of the great lessons I've learned as a coach. And I'm going to carry it over, because, we took the old Urban Meyer principle of 10, 80, 10, 10% engaged, 80% not engaged, 10% actively engaged. So I'll go to the next slide. And we took this concept, right? And so, I believe, and I've learned this from Mike Lombardi and Coach Belichick, about coaching in thirds. And if you recognize it on any team, man, 10% of your team is going to do exactly what you want to the highest standards all the time, or as much as they can possibly do it, man. And 10% of your team is going to be disengaged. They're not going to be bought in. They're going to be negative. And sometimes they can be like a bucket of crabs and keep trying to pull every other guys down. And sometimes it's just like a quiet, cynical, why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? Kind of quiet locker room issue. But you're always going to have these 2 spectrums on either end. But your team is basically in the middle. Most people, and it's just okay, most people are just average, and they're not engaged in all the elite things that the team does, but they're kind of in the middle of that bell curve. And I think the thing that we have to understand as coaches is that we have to coach the top 10%. And so many of us spend all of our time on the bottom 10%. And I'm not saying I don't want to save kids, because I do spend a lot of time on that bottom 10%, but I'm going to spend my public time, my team time, lauding and talking about that top 10%, because when you talk about the bottom 10%, that middle curve starts to shift to them, because everybody wants attention. And so they'll start to shift, and they'll start to notice the things that maybe those guys are doing that they didn't realize. But man, when you talk about the top 10%, when you talk about those who are actively engaged, those who want to be elite, those who want to compete, those who are tough and smart and want to perform under pressure, your middle percent starts to go to them. And then your 10% feels them catching up, and they raise it up a notch. And then your 80% catches them. And what used to be a 10%er is now just right down the middle. And you start to see the standards raise. And then the lesson I think is really cool, and not everyone can grasp this on your team maybe, but you take the 10%ers, the guys who do everything at an elite level, and you say, hey guys, within this group, there's a 10, 80, 10. Like, of our best workers in the weight room, like, some guys are better than others. And so there's a 10%, there's an 80%. And even though that bottom 10% obviously is not disengaged, because they're still a 10%er, they're not at the level of these guys. And so you're constantly chasing and never complacent. And then once guys understand, I want to be a 10%er of the 10% of my team, then I'll say be 10, 80, 10 of the Big 10. Like, okay, well, you're doing a great job for Nebraska, but how are you doing compared to Northwestern or Rutgers or Michigan or Ohio State or eventually USC and UCLA? Like, and it's just this never ending churn for wanting to be a high performer amongst other high performers and getting your middle average guys to find a way to be great.